So we're absolutely privileged to have David Teece join us today to deliver his keynote speech, Dynamic Capabilities for a Sustainable Future. I could say that David Teece doesn't need any introduction, but let's note a few things. As you know, David is a professor of the Haas School of Business in Berkeley, California. He's a big name and has made major contributions in the field of management, particularly in the area of corporate strategy, entrepreneurship, innovation, competition policy. And if you want a humbling experience, of course, people here won't own up to ever looking at their Google citations, yeah? But if you want a humbling experience, is go to Google Scholar and type in David Teece and press return, right? Because as of this morning, over 143,000 citations. Ooh, yeah. So if I live to 1,000 years, I can give him a run for his money. And of course, we know David's seminal work in dynamic capabilities, which is going to be a major part of the talk today. But sometimes in academia, we have this view that there's a tension between practice and research, and that we think it's difficult to blend the two. David has grounded himself in real-world business from the off, and it's really paid off in terms of the contributions that he's made to science. But he's also played a big role in the real world too. So he's the founder and executive chairman of the Berkeley Research Group, an organization with over 2,000 employees, making a huge, big impact in advising businesses and doing research. And he's also a founder of a venture capital company as well. So very much involved in real business. So without any further delay, let's give a warm welcome to David Teece.
Well, good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to be here. And thank you very much, Andrew, for overly generous introduction. But today we've got weighty issues to talk about. And I know sustainability is on your mind, as is transforming business for good. And these are big, hairy issues, and I think one needs a framework for thinking about them. And what I would like to do today is to sort of actually outline a framework. I will speak a little bit about the managerial challenge. I think what managers have to manage today is very different from what they managed a decade ago, let alone 5 decades ago. We need new frameworks and theories. That's the job of us as academics, as well as active consultants, and hopefully occasionally managers as well. And I do believe the missing link in our research, and an area that I continue to focus on, is the need for a really rich theory of capabilities, of organizational capabilities. I say that particularly as an economist, where there's no theory of capabilities. The fact that economic science has gone as far as it has without the word capabilities entering the vocabulary, except maybe in the field of development economics, is a statement that no economist can be proud of. And also systems thinking. Systems thinking was part of management years ago. It no longer is, but I think it's time to bring it back. And as we think about sustainability and the multifaceted nature of sustainability, it's not just dealing with climate issues, it's dealing with a whole set of new issues around the preservation of democracy and society as we know it, of open societies. So there's a lot that we have to worry about together, and I look forward to outlining my thesis for why we have to worry about it, and then hopefully providing a few guidelines for how we might do that as scholars and as executives. So first of all, we all have to recognize that we're in a very different world today. I have lived my life in what some people might refer to as a period in which we took a vacation from history. History of humanity has been about war, and it's been about struggles, and it's been about all kinds of other calamities. But the last 70 years, until quite recently, has been very calm. So we're dealing with a very different world, and I don't think our management theories are equipped for that yet, although I think they can be. I also think that we need to recognize that in this new world, technology leadership, both at the enterprise level and at the national level, is absolutely critical, not just for competitiveness in markets, but also for maintaining open societies. So we need to discuss that as well. So in essence, a sustainable future to me depends on actions, not just of businesses, but also of individuals and of governments. So what are the new theories that I think we need to have in order to address these challenges? First of all, I think we have to pay a lot more attention to economic development and enterprise development. And as I hinted at earlier, I don't think we can deal with these questions, whether it's questions of sustainability, whether it's questions of the long-term viability of the enterprise, without a rich theory of capabilities. And we don't really have, we're beginning to have in the field of management some vocabulary for talking about this, and I'll go into that in a moment. But that vocabulary has not been shared outside of the field of management, needs to be shared outside the management, and I think there is a thirst for that vocabulary and those theories outside of the field of management, which creates opportunities and requirements for us all. Now, a few far-sighted economists, not many, but one or two, Giovanni Dossi here in the room is one of them, has recognized the importance of capabilities, as has John Sutton at the London School of Economics, where he has gone so far as to say the proximate cause of differences in the wealth of nations lies, for the most part, in the capabilities of firms. We don't find that in Adam Smith, although it's not inconsistent with Adam Smith. You don't find that in economics more generally, but it really puts the firm front and center, not just in economic development, but also in sustainability. So bearing that in mind, we have a place, at least management scholars have a place, and executives have a place in shaping the future. So if I stand at 50,000 feet, this is how I see the world as being different. Because we had, a system of fairly stable global governance, we could rely on globalization and extended supply chains and focus on efficiency to drive economic growth and to keep prices low. So that was a period from 1950 to 2020. So not surprisingly, our textbooks, particularly those in managerial economics, focused on optimization and efficiency. And we all got good at putting marginal this equal to the marginal that, and figuring out how to solve complex algorithms, all of which is consistent with optimization and efficiency, but is not always consistent with innovation and capability building. In fact, there's a significant literature in management, I'm thinking of Tushman and Benner and many others, that point out that the pursuit of efficiency will frequently compromise innovation, that you can't do both together unless you're incredibly ambidextrous. And in general, I think there's going to be some sacrifice to innovation if, in fact, you focus purely on efficiency. And sustainability itself, I think, requires a different prioritization consistent with the weighting that I've now indicated. So let's just dwell for a moment on the managerial challenge. And as we go through this, ask yourselves, is this reflected in the textbooks? Besides sustainability, and I'm not trying to say that we deprioritize sustainability, but we have to recognize that the geopolitical landscape is dramatically different. Corporations are asked not only to focus on climate issues and multiple stakeholder issues, but now there's a whole new set of things ranging from export controls to sanctions to, in the U.S., to CFIUS, which is about the regulation of foreign investment. Europe has its equivalent. There's new regulatory issues coming down in the tech space in respect to M&A. So the agenda of top management is being crowded by a whole bunch of new issues. So at the same time as sustainability and climate issues are getting attention, there's demand for attention elsewhere. And as I said in my opening remarks, I think one of the things that has to be put into ESG is actually the preservation of democracy itself. We can no longer take open societies for granted, not just because of geopolitical challenges, but also because of technological challenges. So I don't think that's in the textbooks yet, but it needs to be. So there is, if you will, a perfect storm of risk and uncertainty that's arriving in the executive suite and in the boardrooms. On the one hand, in the U.S. in particular, we've discovered the vulnerabilities associated with relying on China for a supply chain. And Germany is discovering the vulnerabilities of relying on China for a market. So the whole question of the role of China in the global system is creating a new set of issues. At the same time, Western governments have gone deep into sanctions and export controls, and these are global in nature. And not to say there aren't some very large gaps in it, but these are very important requirements for management that, in addition to their day-to-day business, they have to make sure that they're complying with all of these new rules and regulations, and at the same time dealing with climate and other issues. So there is a perfect storm of risk and uncertainty, and behind it all, to be honest about it all, is a relative decline of American power. I mean, the Pax Americana kept the things relatively stable for 70 years. The relative decline of the U.S. is now only 22% or less of the global economy. I forget the exact number. That there are challenges to the post-World War II system that Europe, particularly the UK and the US, fashioned. And it's said very concisely by none other than President Vladimir Putin when he remarked in St. Petersburg recently that new powerful centers have formed on the planet. We're talking about revolutionary changes in the entire system of international relations. I think he's right. He's not right on a lot of other issues, but I think he's right on that one. And that obviously has implications for our textbooks, and not just for international business, but for corporate strategy and management more generally. So what you have now is not only technological disruption, and there's a very large literatures on disruption, where, of course, the primary driving force that's recognized in the textbooks is around technology, but increasingly we have to put geopolitics into that as well. So we need a new system and a different prioritization on a go-forward basis. I wrote a paper about 5 or 6, I wrote it 7 or 8 years ago. It was published about 5 years ago, talking about the bifurcation of the global economic system. And it's perhaps better to think of it as the trifurcation, because you've got, emerging China bloc around China and Russia with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin as everlasting friends, and other autocratic countries. You've got a Western bloc, which of course includes the UK and Europe and Japan, and then you've got a non-aligned bloc, I suppose, or a non-committed bloc, which includes India and Turkey and many others. So if you're executive of an enterprise, and you don't have to be a very big enterprise to be multinational, even quite small enterprises today are multinational in scope, you've got a really complicated radar screen and set of issues to deal with. And in fact, you see this in the statements of leaders, and Ursula von der Leyen remarking, we need to ensure that our company's capital, expertise, and knowledge are not used to enhance the military and intelligence capabilities of those who are also systemic rivals. And that's really putting another burden on the back of management. And the statement from Anthony Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State, is very much in the same vein. We're counting on business to pursue growth responsibly, assess risk soberly, and work with us not only to protect but to strengthen national security. So national security in Europe, in the United States, in Japan, and many other countries is now much more a priority on the corporate agenda at the same time as you've got climate change and many other issues. So we're going to need a framework to try and balance that. And the beginning part of that framework is to recognize the huge difference between management of risk and management of uncertainty. In my view, you've got to take the label risk management off of the doors of the risk management department and use the word uncertainty management. And as Frank Knight pointed out, I think in 1922, there's a very big difference. With risk, you can put probabilities on things and they're easy to manage. You can take insurance if insurance is available, and you can do your normal optimization calculations. But with uncertainty, you don't know what future scenarios there are. You can't put probabilities on unknown unknowns. And so management is now facing the management of unknown unknowns. And I can tell you that 99% of everything that's written about uncertainty in economics is really about risk. But what we need to be managing and figuring out how to manage is uncertainty. And of course, that requires agility. It requires figuring out what are the likely future scenarios. Even if you can't figure them out precisely, at least you can give some indications and begin some tentative planning for uncertain futures. So we're in this VUCA world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Not surprisingly, this VUCA terminology, I think, began first with the U.S. Army, although it probably has a history longer than that. But now it has to also be very much on the lips of management. And it doesn't mention risk, you'll notice. It mentions uncertainty, but also mentions complexity and ambiguity. So we need to get really good at managing complexity and ambiguity, and that's going to take us back to systems theories. And of course, there are conflicting priorities everywhere. At the global level, as we try to deal with climate change, and as relationships between China and the West, and particularly between China and the United States, fray, it's very hard to get any kind of climate agreement. And I think I read recently that China is building something like 3 to 4 coal-fired power stations a week. And, clearly, that's something that all nations should try and put a cap on, because it's probably the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases ever. But how can you get to such cooperation when you have this trifurcated global system? All of this is simply to say that there's complex trade-offs here, and we need frameworks to look at that. So what might those frameworks look like? Well, first of all, a framework is needed to deal with uncertainty. If the framework doesn't deal with uncertainty but focuses on risk, I would count it out. We need new theories of the business enterprise. We need new theories of organization, and particularly new theories of the business enterprise itself. Economics is way behind the frontier of what's required. Economics read entrepreneurship out of the theory of the firm a long time ago. It read uncertainty out of the theory of the firm, and it read capabilities out of the theory of the firm. Nonetheless, it yielded 3 Nobel Prizes for work on the theory of the firm. So you can see that despite 3 Nobel Prizes being earned, we are still very much in a primitive state in the field of economics. We're in a primitive state everywhere, to be honest, although I think in organization theory and in organizational behavior, there are some ideas and concepts that are useful. And that's why I think we need to look for something. We need to build an entrepreneurial theory of the firm, because, entrepreneurs not only are good at, addressing opportunities, but they're also good at addressing threats. So any theory of the firm or any conceptualization of the firm which doesn't recognize entrepreneurship, both with respect to managing the upside and the downside, is unlikely to be helpful. So what we need is an entrepreneurial theory of the firm, and we also need, I think, to have a theory that's not just formal or rigorous, but also relevant. And you're all aware of this trade-off between rigor and relevance. And James March, amongst others, popularized this trade-off 20 or 30 years ago. And quite recently, George Akerlof, Nobel Prize winner in economics, was rather critical of economics, and in my view, appropriately so, because economics had focused too much on the formalization, on the rigor side, and as a result, you had a lot of smart people doing irrelevant work. So figuring out where to exist on this trade-off is important. Business schools have actually been, somewhere in the middle. So there's hope that in business schools, if we can combine good understanding of the real world with good theories, business schools can be on the frontier of moving the social sciences forward. I don't think business schools can claim that honor yet, but because there's the necessary juxtaposition of relevance and practice along with trying to be theory-based or at least framework-based, business schools, if they put their shoulder to the wheel, have a chance to make a difference here. And this is where I suggest that it's time for us to think about systems theory once again. If you go back to the early issues of Journal Management Science in the 1950s, and I did flick through them a few years ago, the focus was really on systems thinking. The hope was that management science would be about systems. But what happened is that the systems thinking really was so abstract at the time that it really didn't provide any useful guidance. It's not enough to say everything's interconnected with everything else and there are feedback loops everywhere. You've got to say, what are the important feedback loops? What are the important levels of interconnection? Where is alignment and complementarity critical? When is it not so critical? Well, actually, business schools research on decentralization and on modularization, for instance, does address these questions. So it's time for us to go back to a systems mindset and recognize that interdependencies matter, that feedback loops matter, that you've got to keep multiple perspectives in mind at the same time. Of course, that's not convenient for doing research. We like to break problems down into their individual components and focus on those components because it's easier. It's no time. We can no longer be intellectually lazy. That may be smart for getting tenure, and maybe it has to be that way for getting tenure. But once you have tenure, you have no excuse anymore, in my view. You've got to address the problems as they are, not as you wish them to be. But nevertheless, a lot of scholars seem to stay on the same trajectory of doing narrow reductionist work, which is of limited importance. So there's an opportunity here to be different. So here we have Kenneth Boulding, long passed away, noting that there is a big demand for systems theory, but there's not much in the way of a supply of it. In other words, there's very little scholarship on it. And I'm going to suggest to you that a workable systems theory or framework is the dynamic capabilities framework. And I'll try and develop that as we go forward here. I think most of you have some familiarity with dynamic capabilities. And, I think you're aware of what it is, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much other than to point out that, there are really two, perhaps three different classes of capabilities that we need to be familiar with. There's what I call ordinary capabilities, and I see some of you taking photos, which is great, but the slides will be available later if anyone is interested. Ordinary capabilities, and this was, I think, a term that Sid Winter first coined, are really about operations and doing things right and optimization. And you go back to my earlier slide about the world of efficiency, ordinary capabilities underpin efficiency. They're about doing things well. At the other end, you've got dynamic capabilities, which doesn't pay as much attention to efficiency. Efficiency is in the background, but it's about doing the right things. It's about getting the right strategic fit. It's about developing the right products at the right time. And that it's not about optimization at all. It's about managing under deep uncertainty. And as we'll see, it's about sensing, seizing, and transforming. And then in the middle, you've got what I call superordinary capabilities. It's taken me a long time to work out this simple taxonomy. So sitting somewhere in between dynamic capabilities and ordinary capabilities, what I call superordinary. You can be very good and more efficient than other companies. And great companies will develop some capability that is unique to them. But at some point, the markets change and that capability is no longer relevant. But for a while, you may have superordinary capabilities that actually are difficult for others to imitate, whereas ordinary capabilities are available essentially from the world stock of knowledge, and it's all about best practice. Ordinary capabilities is about best practice, and superordinary is about signature process. It's a little bit beyond best practice, but it's still in the gestalt of best practices, whereas dynamic capabilities is really about the superordinate direction of the company and the ability to figure out the next big thing and then go develop it and produce it and then transform as you move forward. So one of the things I like to put out is to remind people that best practices can be the kiss of death. They're not presented that way. Best practices in and of themselves sound like something you should all have. I think Motorola had best practices and won all kinds of best practice awards as it went out of business. So you can have best practices and go out of business because the practices may be best for a particular defined set of activities, but those activities are no longer relevant to market circumstances. So understanding that best practices can get in the way of long-term survival and growth is very important. And, I think good managers really understand dynamic capabilities. I didn't invent anything. All I did was find words for what top managers of good companies do in the best of times. And when I say in the best of times, I mean managing in the best of times. So here is a very sort of plain language statement about the kind of trade-off that I'm indicating between efficiency and innovation. And this is Indra Nooyi. She's no longer the CEO at Pepsi, but when she came in, she said, I had a choice. I could have gone pedal to the metal, stripped out costs, delivered strong profit for a few years, and then said adios. But that wouldn't have yielded long-term success. So I articulated a strategy to the board focusing on the portfolio we needed to build the muscles we needed to strengthen the capabilities that we needed for the future. So there's a clear statement of, okay, I'm throwing efficiency under the bus, and I'm really focusing on developing new products, which is essentially, in the case of Pepsi, something other than sugar water for the marketplace. So I think managers understand these trade-offs, but it's so easy, particularly if you're short-term focused, to come on into a company and improve profitability by a cost reduction program. But as all good professors know, the bottom quarter of your class can do a cost reduction program, but only the top 1 or 2% of the class can figure out a great strategy and implement it for the future. So the easy stuff is cost cutting, and of course that's where managers go when they're in trouble, and sometimes that's where they have to go if they've overspent and their portfolio's out of whack. But it shouldn't distract you from investing in R&D and doing the longer term things to build capabilities for the future. And here's a statement from Jeff Bezos along the same lines. There are decisions that can be made by analysis. Unfortunately, there's this whole other set of decisions that you can't immediately boil down to a math problem. So optimization, even at a place like Amazon, can only take you so far. And Apple, likewise, here's Tim Cook saying Apple has the ability to innovate and create magic. What the heck is magic? Well, this isn't something you can just write a check for. It's something you build over decades. So ordinary capabilities, you can always bring yourself up to best practice. You can hire consultants. You can read the textbooks. It's not easy, but it's available to you if you want to push for best practices. But dynamic capabilities is something, as Tim Cook says, you have to build. You can't write a checkbook for it. You can't take out your checkbook and just acquire it. Even though through acquisition, you might be able to bring in some capabilities that'll help you build dynamic capabilities, it's not something for which there's a market. And as we all know in the field of strategy, when you have non-priced assets, that's also the area you can go for building competitive advantage longer term. And to simplify this dynamic capabilities framework, I did two things. First of all, I talked about dynamic capabilities for 20 years before I realized I had to talk about what it is not, which is ordinary capabilities. So you'll notice I spent time telling you what a set of capabilities that are not dynamic, and they fall into this ordinary and superordinary capability. But also found a way to simplify the buckets of things that you have to do well to have strong dynamic capabilities. And it comes down to these three big buckets of sensing and sense-making about the environment and the opportunities ahead. Seizing, which is about execution, and bringing the resources together to get the job done. And then if you're successful, you're always got to be transforming. Just like Trinity Business School has transformed itself. All great organizations have to transform themselves. Some people say continuously, and I say, well, generally continuously, depending on the environment. But when there's deep uncertainty and a lot of shocks and changing events, yes, it has to be almost semi-continuous. So it's not just a one-shot thing. It's something that happens more frequently, although not all the time. So let me just walk through very briefly these three big buckets of activity. Sensing and sense-making are really about looking at the business environment and looking also inside at your research and development capabilities and figuring out, what's a new set of products and services you can add to the future. And, one cannot get there through analysis alone. One has to get there through experimentation and building hypotheses about the future. This is where the scientific method, the principles of scientific method of essentially putting up a hypothesis and testing it, not in a formal way, but informally, testing it with your colleagues, testing it with customers, testing it with suppliers. You start to develop a narrative about where the company can go and what the profit opportunities are ahead and what the constraints are. So sensing and sense-making is absolutely critical. And here you have, Jack Welch saying it's like the ability to see around corners. Managers need, amongst all the other things they have to be great at, they have to see around corners. And we know that's not easy, but it's a great metaphor for getting across the fact that it's not about observing what's right in front of you, or if it is about observing what's right in front of you, but it's also about observing what's on the periphery. And it's also about making sense, because a lot of people can look at the same data and come to very different conclusions. And Kenneth Boulding here again, the systems thinker, is saying the future is bound to surprise us. That's the world of deep uncertainty, but we don't have to be dumbfounded. And uncertainty management doesn't mean hopeless. If you think about likely scenarios, then you're not dumbfounded when the world comes to you. Let me just skip ahead to talk about seizing. The classic case, of course, was Xerox PARC, where they figured out that computing was the future, and they figured out personal computing was the future. They invented the mouse, they invented the laser printer, they invented the Ethernet, they invented all the key elements associated with a personal computer. But management back in Connecticut, I think, is where their headquarters were just not interested in moving forward. Of course, Apple seized the opportunity, and that's where the Mac came from. But that's a classic case of a company sensing the future, but failing to execute. And execution typically takes good alignment, and this is sort of bringing us to a systems thinking idea. And of course, the literature in organizational behavior is got some discussion of these issues, but like think of the original Apple iPod. Making that happen, in some sense, it was just another MP3 player, but behind the curtain, in there was bringing together some new technology with a mini hard drive so it could store a large amount of music. Importantly, in order to get the publishers to put music on the internet, there had to be digital rights management or digital encoding, which Jobs managed to get technology developed for that. And he created the online music store. The relevant software and hardware came together, and then he also went out and got the artists to beat up on the publishers to say, I want my music in the iStore. So all of that together is part of what I call asset orchestration. So this process of seizing or execution in a world of complex systems is about asset orchestration and integration and alignment. And these are words that are easy to say, but when you're in a company, they're hard to manage. And clearly Elon Musk has done that incredibly well. And here you have a quote from Peter Thiel, noting that what's really impressive both about Tesla and SpaceX was the integration of all the bits and pieces. This is actually done surprisingly little today. And so I think this is a sort of a business form that when people can pull it off, it's very valuable. So we just shouldn't take this execution and this integration, this alignment of assets as something that happens automatic. It's a set of skills that management has to develop over time, and the best of them do. And then this transformation, fortunately, there are big literatures in organization theory on transformation, and I won't dwell on that, other than to point out that, of course, there is a structural rigidity that comes from past successes and past routines that get put in place that make this task very challenging. As a result, radical transformation is hard. One should never underestimate just how hard it is, and it takes a lot of leadership in order to be successful. There we go. I've found it useful to think about the concept of capability distance. This is not a concept that's really in the literature yet, but if you've got to change your capabilities in order to address the future, surely we need a concept like capability distance, which tells you how hard it is to get from A to B. And you've got to combine that with looking not just at the technology, but does it require a change in business model? If it requires a change in business model, it's a lot harder. Does it require looking at new markets? Maybe yes. That's also a factor. I think we have this notion of market distance in the literature, but there's not much development of the concept of technological distance. How far do you have to go to catch up or to leapfrog? Nor is there much treatment of business model transformation and how hard it is to change one business model to another. These are all areas that are rich for research. And then, of course, to make dynamic capabilities work, you have to combine it with strategy. And this is back to a systems world. You can't have strategy over in one box and capabilities in the other. I like to use the analogy of the Battle of Trafalgar, where Lord Nelson took on both the combined French and Spanish fleets with a much smaller navy and won. And all the textbooks say, oh, it was all about strategy because he managed to T-bone the line. But you have to dig deeper and realize it wasn't just T-boning the line. It was creating confusion on the water so that command and control would break down because he knew the British ships were smaller, more nimble, more agile, and that agility would play, that strength, that capability would play to their advantage. So it's same thing in business. Putting strategy and capabilities together is critical. You can't do strategy without capabilities. You can't do capabilities without strategy. And one analogy I like to use here is chess versus mixed martial arts. I was most annoyed a number of years ago. I spent years plugging away with Mie Jir at Stanford to create the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Strategic Management. When it was finished, the graphical artist came with a cover and it showed a chessboard. And I said, well, you obviously haven't read anything in the encyclopedia, because you wouldn't have put up a chessboard if you'd done so, because while it's a classic formulation of what people like to think of as strategy, the problem with chess is the rules of the game are fixed. They haven't changed for hundreds of years. In business, the rules of the game change all the time. And also there's a finite number of plays, and in the real world there's not. So a better analogy than chess is either jazz or mixed martial arts, where the rules change and all kinds of things are allowed, and there's the opportunity for surprise. So we need new metaphors in thinking about strategy. And where this comes down, how this comes down is that dynamic capabilities really gravitates managers away from a financial logic to a strategic logic. Financial logic is all about buying and selling and asset accumulation and leverage and liquidity, whereas strategic logic is not about buying, it's about building, and it's about not diversification, it's just the opposite. It's about co-specialization, putting together unpriced assets, which are synergistic is key. So a financial logic is a bad logic to bring to the office of the CEO. Not saying it's a bad logic for the office of the CFO, but it's a bad logic for the office of the CEO. So let me, I'm almost out of time here. Let me just sort of address some of the issues around sustainability. As I've said, there is this connection that you can't think about sustainability in its own, if you're thinking of it climatically in its own category. You've now got to factor in national security and a whole bunch of other mandates that are on this C-suite's radar screen. And part of, I think, the going forward solution is, whereas we've often thought of government and the regulator as sort of being oppositional, that there has to be a new world in which government and the enterprise are more partners. And this means, it's not about more lobbying, it's about the opposite. Things are moving so fast that governments don't actually understand what the real challenges are. And so business and government has to get together in some type of forums so that actually government can learn what's happening, because the rate of learning in government is just way too slow for the changing global environment. So a positive partnership is necessary. And this is not about duplicating the Chinese system. The Chinese system, of course, you can't tell the difference between government and private enterprise, in as much as private enterprise has to follow the mandates, not just the regulations, but the mandates of government. And you actually have cells of the CCP that are inside the corporation, like a continuous monitoring of the company. That's not necessarily the right model that I'm suggesting, but one in which there is a constructive dialogue between government and the enterprise is important. And dynamic capabilities, I think, are actually critical for a lot of ESG initiatives, dealing with climate issues, dealing with waste, dealing with all the greening issues requires dynamic capabilities. And there's actually, interestingly, a literature out there. A number of you, perhaps some of you in this audience, have been writing, I think, very constructively about how dynamic capabilities can help in the movement towards new technologies and new operating models and new business models that actually meet these other goals. And that's true in Italy as well, where this concept of circulation has gotten attention, and dynamic capabilities, according to the body of research out there, are very important for that. So let me just focus, as I wind up here, on the role of boards and the role of yourselves as scholars. I think boards are incredibly important to this new set of issues. But unfortunately, I don't think we've been populating boards the right way to get people that are deeply ingrained in these issues, understand these complex interdependencies, and then are willing and able to support management when they make bold decisions. The one thing I've learned about dynamic capabilities is that it really requires managers to make some pretty big, bold, brassy bets from time to time. And boards are usually cautious, and they don't come up with new initiatives, but they certainly back down other people's initiatives. And the CEO is then in a straitjacket where the CEO and the management team may well understand that radical change is necessary, but boards are actually standing in the way of it, whereas boards should be the ones that are anointing it. And I do notice that the companies that have the strongest, the Elon Musk of the world, the Steve Jobs of the world, the Bezos of the world, these are founder-owned companies where they can basically have tremendous power with and almost over boards, and that's part of the necessary success. You need bold managers to accomplish these goals, and if you got boards that don't like anything that's bold, they're actually standing in the way of the long-term transformation of the business enterprise. So we need new mental models on boards and in the executive suite. We need new models of corporate governance. So much in the literature is around agency theory and the role of boards, which is to stop malfeasance, financial malfeasance by management. That has crowded out these much more critical issues. I think 2/3 of the literature should go in the dump, and we should begin anew to think about the role of boards in the world we're in today rather than the world we were in yesterday. I put forward the dynamic capabilities framework because it is a kind of reduced form systems theory. It recognizes, not just multiple disciplines from economics to finance to marketing to organizational behavior to behavioral psychology, but it tries to tie them together in some fashion and speak to the independencies and feedbacks. And sadly, there's really nothing in the management literature today that I'm aware of, at least, that really does that. But it's critical for what we need to do in the future here. And I'll just leave you with this as a closing slide, which shows how dynamic capabilities and the capabilities ideas more generally link to strategy, to resources, to institutions, to competition. It's at least an organizing framework, and we all have an immensely difficult challenge to bring all of this complexity and all of these many issues that are now confronting us with great urgency to the desks of the managers and as educators and as researchers. It's time for us to actually develop relevant frameworks, and it's time to us to work with managers to help them in the stewardship of the enterprise, which has got to be their number one job. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you, David. And now we're going to have a panel discussion. So we're going to welcome a few panel members up on stage. So first, I'd like to welcome on stage Hilary O'Mara. She's the Country Managing Director of Accenture. So Hilary, welcome. And yep. I'd also like to welcome Clive Ryan. Clive is the Regional Director for Europe, Middle East and Africa for Meta. Facebook, thank you. Awesome report, Todd. Just to make sure we got the fast-growing entrepreneurial sector represented as well. I'd like to welcome Colm Lyons, the CEO and founder of IDPal. Welcome, Colm.
Let's see you. Nice.
Okay, so we'll see how we go here. We've got a few questions that we want to address here, but we can always open this up to the floor as well. So So let's pick up some of the themes here. So maybe start with you, Colin, if you don't mind.
Yep.
Does transforming business for good mean disregarding shareholders?
Yeah, so I think there's probably an element in the world of the shareholders. People kind of think that the shareholders control everything and you have to keep the shareholders happy. We look at the world slightly different, right? Within the company that I'm involved with. Do you need to keep your shareholders happy is a single question. Yes, you do. Do you need to keep your staff happy? Yes, you do. Do you need to keep your customers happy? Yes, you do. So how we look at that is, how do you keep everyone happy? So the answer to that for us is you look at the company. So the company that I'm involved with is a company called IDPAL. So anytime we're asked a question or we have, some decisions that we need to make, we decide on, is this the best thing for the company? And when we decide if this is the best thing for the company, we realize that feeds down into everything else that's within the organization. So if we just took the shareholders as the only people that we wanted to keep happy, you're more than likely going to have staff that are not happy and staff that will leave. And if you compare that to family, right? So I have a wife, I have 3 small kids. If I have a decision to make for my family, and if I just take it, for my wife and she wants to live in a sunny climate, but my kids lose all their friends, is that the right decision to make? So you make the decision for the family, and the family is the company, is actually the company at whole. So that's how we look at stuff. And I think, going back to a lot of what was presented there over the last 45 minutes, I think for me, one of the things for me is that I never really get to sit back and kind of take time to look at stuff like that. And I think it was an excellent presentation, but there was so much within dynamic capabilities that I see within the business over the last 7 years as it's grown, especially around like the sensing, the season and the transforming. But I don't think you can look at the shareholders as just a single entity on their own.
Actually, you've just gone on to talk a little bit about your business, actually, and actually before we get into the questions, let's maybe double back, actually. So maybe if you just want to introduce IDPAL, yourself, and your initial thoughts on the presentation, and then I'll go across the panel.
Yeah, no problems. So Colm Lyons is my name. I'm the CEO and founder of IDPAL. We probably do need more of an introduction than Hilary and Clive from Accenture and Meta, who are more household names. We provide identity verification services to business in a way through document verification, biometrics, database checks. And what we're essentially trying to do is allow you as an individual to verify who you are to any business and stop fraud. It's kind of, in essence, that's what it does. And I founded the business 7 years ago. I'd never founded a business before. I've been involved in little things, so there was a sense of learning as you go. And I think there are certain frameworks that you use as, and a lot of research that you need to do in advance of actually taking on something like I did. We're now in a position where we've 50 staff across Ireland, the UK and the US, and bringing that back to, David mentioned, as an organization, even though we are a small organization, we're a growing organization, and we have to take into account everything that's happening across the globe. So we verified identities of people from 160 countries last year, which is an incredible thing when you look at it. And we've businesses from all over the world. And there's decisions that you need to make as a business around what types of companies you don't want to deal with. And this is all for the sustainability and the future, and then certain countries that you don't want to do business with as well. And I think that's a really difficult thing. And if you go back to the shareholders, is it the right thing to do for the shareholders for the revenue? Yes, it is, but it's the right thing for the business.
Why do you want to? So maybe do you want to elaborate a little bit? I mean, that's why don't you want to deal with certain countries?
So, I think given examples is probably, a real life story of something that happened. We had a particular customer. They weren't a particularly nice customer. They were fairly irate to deal with. They made our staff unhappy. The staff didn't want to come into work because they had to deal with these customers. The revenue and the opportunity was absolutely huge. That customer, I like, they were in a particular country where fraud is absolutely rife. And our job within the world and within the market is to stop fraud. And because of that, and because of the way fraud was perceived within this country, what they wanted us to do was different to our beliefs and our ethics and how we would work as an organization. So the decision was we would move away from that business. And I think for us, that was, and again, we had to bring our board, we had to bring our shareholders, we had to bring everyone on that journey, that's the right decision, that's the right thing to do. And the funny story about that is 12 months after we made that decision, there was a huge investigation into that company. And if we had been involved at that stage, our business, I can guarantee you, our business wouldn't be in existence today. So I think if you're making the right decisions based on, that sustainable, going back to ESG and everything else, it was mentioned. If you're making those right decisions, you will ultimately get to the right place. And the last quote there from I think Hubert Joly was probably the key thing for me, and it was on the very second last slide. But that idea that about, if you're making the right decisions and that kind of it being good, I think that is a huge relevance for businesses and success.
That's a great example of taking a long-term perspective, sticking true to your values, and turning down short-term profits, which will ultimately undermine the business in the long term. Yeah, I'm sure. So, so moving on to Hilary, do you want to give?
Yeah. So let me introduce myself. So again, really enjoyed that presentation. It was amazing, and actually, listening to it, I would suspect our CEO, our global CEO, would be delighted to hear that a lot of what we're doing resonated with what you were saying. And I think it might be useful just to draw those parallels. But who am I, first of all? Hilary O'Mara. I'm the country managing director of Accenture in Ireland. So yes, very different from Colm, 6,500 employees in Ireland, over 700,000 globally. But I think the first thing I'd say as I introduce myself is I'm 30 years working in business. And over that time, we thought we were changing fast. There was no email when I started. There was, no technology at all, really. But the pace of which we're changing now is on an exponential level that as I look back over 30 years, I realize we're in a totally different ball game now. And that's that requires new leadership, to the point, David, that you are making. And that's something that maybe we can come back to, but that is something Accenture's really focused on. But who is Accenture? You might think you know who Accenture is. And again, back to this point about this uncertainty that we're seeing in the world. So not everybody does know us, actually, but at our core, we're a professional services organization. So we do consulting. We support our clients around consulting, around technology, around business operations. But that just almost tips the iceberg of what Accenture is today. It is one of the largest creative agencies in the world. It has one of the biggest investments in innovation and R&D. We hire not just graduates coming out of Trinity and UCD and all of the top colleges who have 2-1 or above. We are looking for completely different sources of talent, from apprenticeships through to PhDs. So the point is that we have had to reinvent ourselves many times, and that reinvention is happening faster and faster as we respond to the uncertainty that is in the world we live in today. I think the other probably thought I'd have, just by way of opening, is there's so many things I could say, to be honest with you, but if I look at, I'm new in role, so I'm only in the role of country managing director for the last 6 months. So what did I do when I first came in? The first thing I realised was the world is very different now to my predecessor's world. And if we keep doing what he did, and he did it very well, we will be dead in 10 years. That is, we have to keep reinventing. So that is a big part of, I feel, my responsibility. The second thing is Accenture is incredibly good at process efficiency, optimization. We call it the brilliant basics. That is just a given. You just have to have that. You can't not have it. But as David said, it isn't going to make you successful. And so when I came in, the first thing we did was we took a look at what was happening in the Irish market. We looked at where the opportunities were, where the threats were, what we were doing well, not so well. So I equate that to sensing. We really thought about that, and we really thought about our priorities and where we were going to focus. So I like to kind of tap myself on the shoulder and say we were doing sensing. We then said, right, what are we going to prioritize and go after and go do to be able to drive effectively, I suppose, the strategy. And so we've mobilized now the capabilities, the focus, the targets to go after and seize the opportunity. So again, I think we are out there and we are seizing. And then finally, it is going to be about continuous transformation. You cannot sit still. We tell our clients now, used to be you do a digital transformation or you do an operations transformation. It is now about continued transformation every day, every month, every year, or you're not relevant. And I think that's the transformation piece that David was talking about. So it really resonated with me, and a really nice way to explain it, actually, sensing, seizing, transformation. So that's probably by way of introduction enough for me.
Great. Thank you, Hilary. And Clive.
Great.
Yeah, I think you're. Yep. Let's just switch it on. Is it? Yep. There you go. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you, Professor. Hello, everybody. I work for Meta. We are the, holding company for services I hope you use: Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. And I am the Global Operations Director for EMEA. I've been with the company for 11 years, and that means nothing to my kids. 11 years is a long time. So I explain my time with the company in terms of 24 versions of iPhone have been released since I started. Back to your analogy on the iPod. I've been in lots of different roles. I started with the company in a commercial role. So thinking about competitive advantage, product development, satisfying clients. But the role I've had for the past 4 years in operations is actually about safety, keeping our platforms and arguably the internet safe against global uncertainty, government risk, global uncertainty and economic uncertainty. And when I was, my first couple of reactions to David's excellent talk was actually, when I think about how it applies to my role, it's not about competitive advantage, it's actually staying ahead of the bad guys. Because a lot of the job I spend my team spends doing is actually thinking about risk, maybe uncertainty. I know that slide, and thinking about how we can get ahead of, bad governments, dangerous organizations, individuals, and just bad people trying to trade and do business on the internet. So that's how we deploy that. The second reaction was that when I tried to map David's frameworks onto what we've been doing at Meta, it wasn't designed this way. I think it's probably accident. But we have a set of company values, 6 company values, but 3 or 4 of them I can actually map on to the dynamic capabilities framework. And that is 1, move fast. It used to be move fast and break things. I'll give you a history about that. Was move fast. 2 is build awesome things. It's a very American phrase, but it's a big principle of how we build things. And 3, focus on long-term impact. There's the 4th one you may apply, which is called live in the future. When I think about our founder, Mark Zuckerberg, so many will know of him. He is a CEO who has been described to me as a CEO who thinks in the long term with incredible urgency. So that focuses the business on very much the long term, and building fast towards that long term. The second thing that occurs to me as my third reaction is, I just learned actually this week that Mark Zuckerberg is a huge fan and practitioner of AMA, would you believe? Which is your, not a jazz player, but AMA. So I think I learned an awful lot of the formal thinking, the systems thinking they've introduced today around what we've been doing in Meta, and we just don't think about it in terms of systems, more in terms of culture.
Great, thank you. So, Hilary, maybe I'll go back to you. I mean, you obviously, in Accenture, advise a lot of boards and management. What do you do to get, or do you get them to focus on the long term now? And if so, how do you do it?
Get the boards to think
Yeah.
Well, I think, I suppose the first thing is we talk about 1 foot in today and 1 foot in tomorrow, which again, I think goes back to a lot of what David was talking about. So, of course, being a public company, quarter is important and quarter results are important. But I think what Accenture has been incredibly good at, and I think any successful company, to be honest, is good at, is looking at that long term. So similar to what Meta, what you just talked about there, Clive. So the way I look at it locally, which I think is emulating what was happening globally, is that the team are focused on the quarter and just out doing the work. But we're also looking ahead and we're placing the bets. And I do believe they're bold bets and they're getting bolder. for the future. And if you look at anybody you talk to, any businesses that we work with, they're laying foundation. And if they're successful today, it's something they did 4 years ago that actually is coming to pass now, or they're continuing to reinvent themselves, this continuous transformation to be successful. So I think short-term and long-term is something that's well understood in Accenture. And then I think from a board perspective, it's about education of that board. You have to spend time with your board. You have to bring them through the rationale for why you want to do a certain thing. And if you really believe in something and you're passionate about it and you explain why it's important, boards will listen. And I think, boards are having to change, and that's why it's very important who you select to be on your board. I mean, one thing that I heard just last week, which has really stuck with me, is at last year's Davos, 40% of the organization said if they do not transform, they will not be around in 10 years. So as a board, you have a responsibility to ensure your organization is not going to just be around, but be thriving and growing and developing. So I think they feel that responsibility now, that they have to really come with an organization in a way that maybe when it was Steve Jobs' time, Steve had to kind of work around the board, as David said. I think nowadays a board, not every board, but a really good board is with you on that. But as long as you're communicating to them, explaining it, and if you have the passion for it, they will go with you. But it requires work. You have to, it's part of your stakeholder groups to manage your board and get them to believe in what you want to do.
I'd always say to Hillary's point, you have to bring them on the journey. So if you're coming into a board meeting and there's a surprise, there's a problem, right? And you need to make sure that board and every single person on that board are all on the same page. They've all been given the time, the respect, and the same amount of kind of energy put into it to bring each of those people along that journey, because the board are there to challenge you on a lot of what you're talking about and what that kind of future sense that you're looking at. And that's kind of their responsibility from that point of view. But you need to convince them to a degree, and by convince them, you're bringing them on the journey, really.
Okay, I mean, I think we all want to obviously take a long-term perspective, but I suppose the key here really is, or the challenge is when there's a seriously big short-term cost. So yesterday we had Barry Robinson, and she was talking about the frustration with green energy. She said that we're so close. We've got to get through this hump, get off fossil fuel. But once we do, we can get into this zone where we have clean energy, whether that's, a combination of solar, wind, fusion, hopefully. So where do you all sit? And it's an open question if anyone wants to jump in terms of, in taking a position on that. I mean, particularly if you're advising, so maybe David with the Berkeley research group, where are you kind of passive in that regard in terms of saying, look, we'll outline the long term, you guys can decide, or do you actually try and push the dial and say, listen, you've got to be on the cutting edge of this for your own long-term good?
Yeah. Look, this is one of the great conundrums. When you're trained as an economist, you think the role of firms is to maximize profits. I've come to the view that you won't maximize profits if you try to maximize profits. So you've really got to focus on stewardship, which is what you're hearing here, and paying attention to what really matters. And this is where you need the help of boards, because you got shareholder activists out there who are masquerading. They're really traders masquerading as shareholders. So this notion of shareholder first, I'm fully in favor of it if they're, quote, holders, which means they're in there for the long term. But what happens in contemporary economies is that in fact the shareholder activists are looking, if you're lucky, for the next quarter or the quarter after that. And this is where boards are critical, because boards have to help management face down those short-term factors. And they're also, boards are burdened typically by their own incentive plans, actually, which incent them to pay attention. So, we need to restructure the compensation of management to make sure it's backloaded, not front-loaded. I think clearly in the long run, profitability is absolutely important for long-term stewardship. You can't do without it. And we've had so many stupid debates on this over the last 25 years. I think if you put stewardship first, but be focused on long-term profitability, you can get in the critical things onto the agenda that need to be on the agenda to keep the relevant constituencies, which is not all constituencies. And Oliver Williamson wrote about some of this stuff 20 years ago. You get the critical constituencies that are co-investing with you in the future of the firm, keep them happy, those inside the company and those outside, then you've got a clear way forward. Right now, I think the management literature presents a whole bunch of confusion with respect to what managers should be doing, and it's time to clean it up.
And Clive, I mean, you obviously got a founder who's got a long-term perspective, but you are floated on the markets here. So how do you deal with short-termism?
Can I answer that question?
Yeah.
Part of reaction to that, though, just interesting in your perspective, Professor, because if you look at just global business and, your point around the world after 2020 being, I guess, less about efficiency optimization, more about innovation. But if you think about what's been happening since 2020, we've had two pretty big shocks to the system. Through the COVID pandemic, and then through war in Russia and Ukraine and the economic disruption. And my sense as a layman looking at this is that the long-term plans are ripped up in both occasions. They went to the toilet because you're dealing with the short term. We're going to have many long-term shocks in the next 30 years. How do we actually balance long-term, that kind of cathedral thinking, the long-term thinking, with the shocks that are going to happen in the short term? To your point, we as a company, I guess, have learned a massive hard lesson in the last year and a half, where although we try and think and operate in the long term, our shareholders, our stockholders, really beat us up because that's all they thought we were focusing on. They said, why should we invest for the long term when we want you to do more in the short term? How do you balance both? And that's affected the stock price.
Yes, and I actually give Zuckerberg reasonable credit for pushing for the long term. I mean, Netflix pushed for the long term when the shareholders went crazy, when they dropped, through the mail DVDs. So that's where, and I know kind of Meta is sort of bent to some extent to the short term, and I guess you have to. But that's really what leadership is about, is staring down the investors and taking it on the chops and having supportive boards when you know that you're building the right things at the right time or for the future. But also with you that, look, there's obviously two very big shocks, but the future I'm talking about is there are going to be many more shocks coming, and it's because of the decline in global governance as it existed for the last 70 years. There are other players, there's China, there's Russia, in particular, but China more than most, that have a different view of what global governance should look like, which brings enormous uncertainty unless somehow rather there's an arrangement between the West and China, which I don't think doesn't look like an immediate prospect.
I mean, just to come in there, we see this, just Clive, picking up on your comment and the response there from David, is it's been extraordinary the last three years since COVID. I would say everybody was really worried about the technology disruption in the clients that we talked to. It was all about the disruption, the uncertainty coming with technology. If I'm not on this technology wave, I'm going to get left behind. Then you had COVID and everybody's world was turned upside down. And then you had wars in Ukraine, high inflation, you name it, it's hitting us, the geopolitical landscape. And now what clients say is exactly to your point, David, it's not about, the only thing that's certain is there will be the next shock. And it's probably not too far away. And so how do we build a business that can absorb these shocks and even see opportunity out of these shocks? And it's really interesting. We actually did a piece of research where you're starting to see the really high-performing organizations emerge. And it's probably a trend, so everybody's going to move here, where it's moving beyond just doing transformation programs to this continuous transformation, David, that you talked about, and certain things that you need to actually do. Your workforce has to be ready for change. I mean, we got through COVID. I mean, the change we took on in COVID was unbelievable as businesses, but it was just like we had no choice, so everybody did it. But how do you get your organization, your workforce to respond like that when you do have choice, but it's a shock and the business has to respond? How do you have the technology capability to be able to move really quickly to change lane depending on what's happening when you have a shock? And then back to your point, the third one I'd say is that leadership to go, okay, the shock has come, leading through it, so everybody has the confidence. So it is in the clients we work with, which is many in Ireland and globally, you know, it is now about actually how do you take advantage and manage through shock, because shock is just the new norm. Which is
So what is the difference between what you would be advising and what business CEOs should do today in clear, you compare to 10 years ago? So somebody setting up a company, what's going to be we know in the philosophical terms that it was, but in tangible terms, how would you organize yourself differently today, different to 10 years ago?
So I think if I was to start by saying, you know, when I kind of was growing up in Accenture, we would do the big IT implementation, SAP, Oracle, whatever it might be at the time. And it was all very sequential. You start and you finish, and it might even take you 2 years to get there, right? And that was considered fast at the time, and we thought we were great. And it felt hard at the time. But when I look back, it was one program, sequentially done, A, B, C to Z, and it took a long time. The world now is you are actually taking off literally the shrink wrapper off the technology with the client for the first time. Whereas, you know, 10 years ago, you had to prove you had 10 proven credentials before they'd even employ you to do the work. So it is the pace, it is the level of change. So I think what we're saying to them is, to our clients in this uncertain world, is a little bit of what I just said. Number one, have a view, have a strategy, you know, be really clear, be sensing, right? Back to David's point, be really clear what you're going after, place those bull bets, invest in your technology. Like if you don't, you can't survive in the world today without the technology platforms that actually, when you want to make a change, when you want to bring a new product to market, change a product, if you can't change the technology fast to do that, you're kind of dead. So the technology investment is number two. And number three is actually that ability for your employees to actually have the acumen and the confidence to change with you as you want to drive on. Because
if you look at the banking world, I think that's the perfect example. So you have your old school traditional banks, and then you have your neobanks. So the Revolut, and most people probably are aware of Revolut. So you have the old school banks who, to your point, right? So there's a digital transformation, or there's something that has to happen, and they go through their typical RFP, and by the time they have their RFP decided on and what solution they're going to use, and then they go through the implementation process and the tests and the slow release, it's 2 years, it's 2.5 years, and the technology has moved on. The solutions that they've decided on is now in the past. And the likes of the Revolut, who are just moving, they're staying with the times. And that's why all these neobanks, they have those dynamic capabilities that those large old school banks just don't have the ability to do. And that's down to decision making, it's down to boards, it's down to structures, it's all those things. And that's why now there's questions around profitability and things like that. So it's not a perfect world either. But that's why we're seeing so much more opportunity for people to now have a different banking culture, a different banking lifestyle to traditionally going into that branch. And that's why they need to change so rapidly fast. And they'll struggle, they will, because they don't have that dynamic capability.
So, I know you, but I wanted to ask you a question, so I'll let you come in. I mean, let's talk about democracy here. So one of the key points David brought up was about the fact that, you know, for not for the first time ever, but more than ever, since Second World War, businesses need to be conscious of what role they play in damaging, supporting, or maintaining democracy. And I suppose Facebook are at the front line in this debate. And so, what do you think they need to do? What does Facebook need to do?
Yeah, is that the easy question you want to give me?
That's one we didn't agree up front.
Listen, it's a serious and it's a big question. And very obviously, the internet, not just Meta, the internet plays a huge role in supporting or potentially undermining democracy. It can be weaponized and is being weaponized quite readily, and that's part of my job to stop that happening. I do think, though, that one thing I've heard David speak of before might apply to this question is, I don't think you talked about today, open innovation, whereby the firm is much better and much more powerful by collaborating with others to continue to innovate, to seize, to sense, to transform, rather than doing it on its own. We believe that hugely. But in the context of governments, one of the things that we believe and we're trying to encourage is actually open innovation with governments, not against governments. And why I say that is quite often, the world we live in, the company I work in often gets criticized for being either dangerous or uncaring about content they see online, or perhaps operating in a typical US monopolistic fashion, dominating fashion. And often regulation is a result of that. The fear of what companies like us might do is regulated and controlled. Maybe not as much as it should have been in the past. And we actually believe we need more regulation for the sector that we're in. And we're glad to see it happening in Europe with the Digital Services Act, the Online Harms Bill in the UK, the California Consumer Protection Act. We believe that's right. We believe it's too slow. And we believe it's overly onerous. But I'm optimistic that that's going to change. And for example, there was a vote that went to the European Parliament yesterday. MEPs had to vote on what's called the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act, EUAI. And that's a body of regulation that's going to regulate something that actually doesn't exist yet, you could argue. And that's good, because us and other industry partners are trying to educate governments where we can about what the possibility and power and danger of this new technology could be, to help them understand it, but then to help them put in place useful, thoughtful, and careful regulation that protects industry and society and democracy, but doesn't quell innovation.
Okay, so maybe we'll open up to some questions to the floor. Actually, we just anybody would like to ask a question? On here, do we have a mic? We can send. Yes, there's a mic there. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, so thank you. Luca Pistilli, University College Dublin. So, David, thanks a million for this speech. That was very, very insightful. And also on a personal side, since we met the first time in Banff on the special conference on dynamic capabilities, like your research really impacted my academic career and my research as well. So I was wondering, my comment is, while I fully agree that indeed, like, there are several grand challenges that are affecting our overall society, and indeed, corporations, businesses should work with government in order to, work in a common direction. So, do you think that it's maybe also the time to be even more brave from a researcher point of view and try to apply the framework of dynamic capabilities also to different fields? So perhaps we should even cross the boundaries of management and apply the theoretical framework of dynamic capabilities to political science, perhaps, right? Because I do believe, and by looking at your presentation, this is what I was thinking, that perhaps also policymakers or politicians should sense this and reconfigure as, times are changing and we are experiencing, completely different, turbulent and high wire situation. What do you think about that? Thank you so much.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I heard the question correctly, but let me say the following. Yes, I think we need dynamic capability, not just in the private sector, but in government. And in fact, Mariana Muscato at University College London has a paper on exactly that. And this is the biggest challenge, quite frankly, is bringing dynamic capabilities to government. One way they can do it, the sensing part, government, is to do what you're saying, which is government actually needs to deeply understand the real problems that are confronting business, and they can't make policy in a vacuum. So that led to my point that you need this close cooperation between government and the enterprise, but it also means the government needs to have dynamic capabilities. You saw in the United States Project Warp Speed coming up with a vaccine. That truly was dynamic capabilities, one-shot thing. But generally, government bureaucracies don't have this sensing, seizing, transforming capabilities. And I think the next round of public management reform has to be directed along those lines. And And then it'll be actually easier to perhaps get engagement between industry and government if the government is actually, in a learning modality, which I think most governments are, but there's more of a cooperative spirit in a history, at least particularly in the United States, where there's been antagonism between government and between the regulator and government, and most people have cheered that on because they don't want close cooperation between the regulator and the enterprise. But that mindset has to now be inverted, because there's no way the government can learn fast enough without input from industry. And industry has to be open-minded and fair-minded in the way they provide that information, not try and steer it their own way.
I think so the UK government, from our perspective, right? So we have there's what's called the Digital Identity Trust Framework, and the idea and concept of that is that there's a certain way of proving your identity and a certain standard and a framework that you need to adhere to. And what the UK government have done is, and we're involved in this project, and we're also involved with the Home Office for what's called a right to work check, so the ability to prove your ability to work in a particular country. And what they've done is there is huge collaboration. So they've brought the likes of ourselves and a lot of our competition in, and they're looking at the real life, real world scenarios rather than deciding on this is what we're doing. They've actually brought us all in, and every 2 weeks there's a particular call. There's maybe 30, 40 people that are on the call, and you're running through scenario play. And I think they're brilliant in the way that they've approached it. They're educating themselves by the real life scenarios, what's going to affect you and all of us here. And they're designing that framework based off that, rather than, not talking, not bringing in the different parties and then going, right, this is what we're doing, and everyone's that doesn't work. And you have your version 2, your version 3, and so on. So I think some governments are really good, some are poor. But there's I think that open innovation is not just internally, but it's across all the different sectors, from regulators to governments to business.
Yeah, and also in answer to the other part of your question, obviously business as a field needs to interact more with the other schools around the university. So if we're going to talk about climate change, we need to be engaging with the School of Natural Science and so on. But also, even for business schools that are standalone entities, I think what these grand challenges and the complexity that David Teece is talking about mean for us is that it's now complex enough that, unfortunately, that living in the silos that we have, even among that, not criticizing the SIGs and everything like that, but really to address some of these, we're not going to be able to address them within the niche boxes that we currently have, that we're actually going to have to break out of that and do some research, does interaction. Anyone that does leadership, for example, you find yourself in a leadership role. Well, if you're to feed off just the leadership literature, you'd find yourself just using 2 disciplines, mainly psychology, 3 actually, psychology, organizational behavior, and HRM. But anyone who's in a leadership position realize, well, actually it's strategy and finance and all this other stuff that you actually need to draw on as well. So in order to really address these big issues, you need to have more than those 3 disciplines in play. That would be just one example. We've got time for one last question. Was this 3:30? Okay. Well, thank you so much, David, and thank you so much to our panel. We have some gifts.